You know, once again, we find ourselves with a difficult text to cover this morning, don't we? Now, I actually considered skipping this text this morning and giving a sermon on something full of laughs, like Queen Elizabeth and her pillbox hats. But I know that this is the Word of God. And you see, I respect the Bible as the Word of God. I believe that God inspired the writers of the Bible. God caused them to write about the things which we mere humans need to know. And therefore, if little old me just doesn't happen to like a particular scripture, the problem is probably with me, isn't it? It's not with the scripture. In fact, I often find that when I take time to deal with texts that I don't like or I don't fully understand, God reveals stuff to me, and it helps me grow. And it changes when I learn what it's really about. So I'm going to try and deal with this text this morning. But before I could actually deal with this text, I had to figure out what was making it difficult. So I had to go back and do a little thinking. And it took me back to my boyhood. Back when I was young, maybe 8 or 9 years old, my family was invited to go to a new church with my uncle and his family. The church that my uncle and his family were going to was more a fundamentalist type church. And even though my parents made a very concerted effort to go to that church and to try to be with my uncle and his family, we just weren't a good fit. So we ended up going back to our beloved Wesleyan Chapel United Methodist Church in Aberdeen, Maryland. But one summer evening while we were checking out this new church, I remember it was summer because we were out of school. All the kids were in shorts and having a good time. Our families attended a tent revival that this new church was having. It was being held down by the river in a large field. The tent was huge. It was a huge tent. You know, even as a young boy, I remember going to the circus and just how big it was. That was the kind of feeling that I got from this tent. It was the biggest thing I've ever seen. And when you walked in through the back door, through the canvas doors, there were just rows and rows and rows and rows and rows and rows of chairs. And way on the other end of the tent was a stage that had a preacher. He was just preaching his little heart out. And every chair was just filled. It was filled to capacity. And I remember with my family, we had to stand on the back edge of the tent to hear what was being said. Now I remember the preacher. He was sermonizing about the second coming. He was just up there just jumping around and screaming and yelling, and everybody out in the chairs were praising the Lord and saying amen to everything he had to say. It made a big impression on me, because I remember him talking about the signs of the second coming and how that they had been fulfilled. And that Jesus would be coming soon. At any moment, you have to be ready. You know, as an 8, 9-year-old kid, it seemed pretty scary. And it seemed pretty unlikely to me as well. Because you see, even as a boy, I was a little on the logical side. Rather logical, as Mr. Spock would say. That's for you Star Trek fans, right, John? Okay. If Jesus hadn't come in nearly 2,000 years, what were the probabilities that he was going to be coming tomorrow? Pretty slim, I figured. And so at that time in my life, I was more interested in going out of that tent and catching fireflies than I was to be there worried about the second coming of Christ. So I decided not to worry about it. And I really haven't worried about it since then. But today's scripture having to do with the second coming of Christ, I found that it has something very important. It has some very important things to say to us, whether Jesus comes again in our lifetime or not. For one thing, this scripture, it tells us to get ready and to stay ready. Because you never know what today or tomorrow will bring into your life. Jesus says, be careful or your hearts will be weighed down with carousing drunkenness and the anxieties of life, and that day will close on you suddenly like a trap. That's pretty good advice, isn't it? Get ready and stay ready, so that your hearts won't be weighed down with carousing and think those three things literally kill people. And if you don't believe me, just next time you're at your doctor's office, ask them. He or she is going to tell you that they do. Those are three of the big things. For our soldiers out there. Remember basic training when they wake up in the middle of the night and make you get what I did go for basic training to tell me, well, would you have to go out and get ready for the attack that might be coming? And then they tell you to stand down and go back to bed, right? You have to be ready no matter what. Soldiers, they talk a lot about readiness. Commanders remind them regularly that they need to be ready for whatever might come, whenever it might come. But too many times, military leaders, they've had to relearn that lesson the hard way. In 1941, it was December 1941, shortly after Pearl Harbor, British Brigadier Ivan Simpson, he realized that the north shore of Singapore was undefended. Had no guns, no pillboxes, not even a strand of barbed wire was there. And so Simpson went to see General Percival, the Singapore commander, to warn him of this problem, and to persuade General Percival to do something about it. However, his pleas, they just fell on deaf ears. Finally, Simpson asked Percival why he was refusing to do anything. Percival replied, I believe the defenses of the sort you want to throw up are bad for the morale of the troops and the civilians. And on his way out, Simpson said, Sir, it's going to be much worse for morale if the Japanese start running all over the island. And 2 months later, the Japanese invaded the undefended North Shore, and Singapore quickly surrendered. Soldiers need to be ready for whatever might come. And likewise, we all need to be ready for whatever comes, and especially for the second coming of Christ. I don't know when it will be. I don't know when he will come again. I don't know if it's going to happen in my lifetime. But I do know that Christ warned his disciples. He said, be careful for your heart to be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, and the anxieties of life. And that day will close on you suddenly like a trap. You know, it would be easy to say, well, let's just not get excited now. After all, Jesus hasn't come back in 2,000 years. Why should we think that he'll be coming soon? Let's not inconvenience ourselves now. Let's not even pray now. Let's not worry now. After all, we read the Bible last month. We don't have to read it this month too, do we? Surely, it would be all too easy to say those things, wouldn't it? It'd be easy for us to just say, you know, I'm working on my career goals now. I'll take care of the spiritual stuff later. Or maybe it would be easy to say, I work day and night taking care of my family. I'll learn about Jesus later. Or it would be all too easy just to say, you know, you only go around once. Grab all your gusto you can. When I'm older, more of an invalid, I'll get right with God then. But Jesus, he tells us to be careful or your hearts will be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, and the anxieties of life. That day will close on you suddenly like a trap. Jesus calls us, my friends. He calls us to be ready now because we might not have no warning. And I believe that Jesus calls us to be ready for reasons that go beyond the second coming. He says, be careful or your hearts will be weighed down. Weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, and the anxieties of life. And you know, that's good advice. That's good advice for each one of us, whether we're preparing for the second coming of Christ or just preparing for tomorrow. Get ready is good advice for every day, regardless of what that day might bring. You know, it's always nice to have that rock as a foundation, right? With the sinking sand, guilt, and nothing can stay on it. Because if life brings us, let's say, a loss of a job, it's nice to have that solid spiritual foundation to fall back on. If you're in a car wreck and you wind up in the hospital, having that solid spiritual foundation, that's what we need. If a loved one dies, and you're in mourning and you're grieving, that spiritual foundation that you have is what you need to go on. And you know, there's something else here. There's a great message of hope. And there's a great message of good news in the scripture that we need to hear. In this scripture, Jesus tells of the terrible events that will precede the second coming. He says, there will be signs in the sun, moons, and stars. On the earth, nations will be in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and tossing of the sea. People will faint from terror, apprehensive of what is coming on the world. For the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time, they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. And then Jesus said, when these things begin to take place, stand up and lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. You know, the early church, shortly after Jesus ascended, they thought a lot about his second coming. And their message at that time was always of hope. The great preacher Alexander McLaren, he put it this way. He said, the primitive church thought more about the second coming of Jesus Christ than about death or heaven. The early Christians were looking not for a cleft in the ground called a grave, but for a cleavage in the sky called glory. They were watching not for the undertaker, but for the upper taker. The early Christians were spiritually ready to see Jesus Christ, and they looked forward to his coming. So each one of us today need to prepare ourselves so that we can spiritually be ready as well. Be ready to see Jesus when he comes. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.